Hello and welcome to the RG10 Podcast, and I have some rather bad news for you. There's been some unwelcome action by teenage vandals to public toilets and a wall in Twyford. Some of the offenders have been identified as the result of a report from a vigilant resident, but more information from parishioners about trouble of this nature would be welcomed by the council. Also, there's been an outbreak of teenage vandalism affecting a tree planting project. Regrettably, one ash was uprooted and another ash and a prunus were beheaded. And finally, in summarising the problem of the last year, a parish councillor has referred to a steadily declining standard of public behaviour and cleanliness as regards property, both private and public, and litter. Well, those kids, I bet you're thinking that it wasn't like that back in your day. Except it was. That's because these reports all come from the first ever edition of the Twyford Parish Newsletter, issued back in 1974. That's exactly 50 years ago. And that's what I'm going to be looking at in this episode. I discovered copies of the newsletter in the all-new singing and dancing Twyford Library, and they give a fascinating insight into what was going on in Twyford back in the good old days. Before I go any further, let's do a bit of 1974 in the UK scene setting to give you a flavour of the times. Firstly, imagine a general public dressed in bell-bottom trousers and travelling around on space hoppers. Politics-wise, there wasn't one, but two general elections, both very tight, the year ending with a Labour government. In sport, England's men failed to qualify for the Football World Cup and coach Sir Alf Ramsey was sacked. Not only that, Manchester United were relegated to Division 2. In popular culture, children's TV show Bagpuss hit the screens for the first time, and ABBA won the Eurovision Song Contest with Waterloo. And finally, McDonald's arrived in the UK 50 years later, and they've still not opened a restaurant in Twyford. But there was one big opening that did happen here in 1974, because the ribbon was cut on one of Twyford's tallest landmarks, the footbridge over the A4. This subject came up at the annual parish meeting, where it was suggested that an inclined slope be provided instead of a step ramp. Well, we are still waiting. Before the pedants write in, I know there is a very thin ramp to the side of the footbridge, but it's not really buggy or wheelchair friendly, is it? So, happy 50th birthday to the Twyford footbridge, and here's to another 50 years of structural integrity. Also on the agenda that day, and on the agenda for parents most days ever since, was school places. The Collerton Primary School had been open less than a year, and a certain Mrs. Funnell was asking if parents would now have a choice of where to send their children. There was also talk of a new 17-acre public open space just off Waltham Road and south of the train line, with people being urged to write to the District Council in support of the proposal. Now, I'm pretty sure this refers to what we call Stanlake Meadow Recreation Ground, but I can't find any definitive proof, so do let us know if you can find any. But top of the agenda of that meeting was the question of street lighting, and here's why. From the 1st of January to early March 1974, severe measures had been brought in by the government to save electricity, which had been restricted owing to industrial action by coal miners. For example, there was the infamous 3-day week where commercial users of electricity were limited to 3 consecutive days' consumption each week. Street lighting was also affected, and in Twyford that meant that around 200 lamps had been disconnected. The parish council now had the dilemma of paying for the running of these lamps when the Southern Electricity Board reconnected them. Could they save a few quid by turning them off at midnight? Would the cost of timing switches make this option unviable? Not only that, were the current lamps on major roads actually up to the task, and was money needed for an upgrade? This may sound rather trivial now, but just imagine that you'd spent the most miserable months of the year wandering around in darkness. It wouldn't have been much fun. And just an aside, a group called the Lighting Lobby had the foresight to keep records of the amount of reported crime during the period that streetlights were turned off. I've got no stats for RG10 specifically, but in Brighton, burglaries went up 100% year on year. Maybe the vandalism mentioned at the beginning of this episode could somehow be a reflection of this. There's one to ponder. Anyway, off to King George V's recreation ground now. And what was going on at the tennis club? Well, keen listeners to the podcast will remember the first episode of this season, which was all about the club. The team there was encouraging new members to join, and that's exactly what was happening 50 years ago in the parish newsletter. It was also revealed that due to the increased costs of overheads, the rents of all the clubs using the rec would be increased. For those clubs, the same old hazard existed: dog poo. It was suggested that, and I quote, "The public could help in the reduction of the nuisance and also in enforcing the county council bylaw, which makes it an offence for a person in charge of a dog to allow the dog to foul the footway of any street or public place in Twyford by depositing its excrement thereon. Any person offending against the bylaw is liable to a conviction or a fine not exceeding £20. That's about £180 in today's money. Moving on to dumping of a different variety, and the newsletter mentioned complaints regarding the indiscriminate dumping of garden refuse in hedgerows and public plots of land. The president of the Horticultural Association, Mr. J. Finch, said there was no need for such antisocial measures as no garden is so small that compost cannot be made in it. He then went on to issue instructions for the digging of a compost hole, and in case you're thinking of doing this, then take notes now. It should be 4 foot square and 3 foot deep, screened from the rest of the garden, and it would be enough to compost all the soft material produced each year. Wave goodbye to those brown bins, folks. Now, perhaps my highlight of the newsletter was a report from the Twyford and Ruscombe Community Association, who were responsible for the annual Twyford Fete. Let me read to you some of the details. The Fete is a major source of income for Loddon Hall and has developed from a family show held on Springfield Park to the now widely known event held on the recreation ground on Spring Bank Holiday every year. Of course, nowadays we have the Donkey Derby on that weekend at the Rec, and in the last 10 years, an August village fete has proved to be a massive success at Stanlake Meadows. But do either of these events have such attractions as the Red Devils parachute display team and an escapologist who's suspended in a straitjacket from a burning rope 100 feet above the ground? No, they don't. But they did 50 years ago, something for the organising committee to consider. Finally, back at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned the vandalism affecting a tree planting project. Well, youngsters in Twyford have been asked to come up with poetry inspired by this project. It was printed in the newsletter, and the following, the newsletter said, is surely Reader's Digest material. Pull up a chair, make yourself comfortable, and listen. You could say that trees sway in the breeze. If they did more than that, they would fall flat. And that beautiful couplet brings this episode of the RG10 podcast to an end. You can still keep up to date with Twyford Parish Council via their website, twyfordparishcouncil.gov.org. And depending on where you listen to this episode, do remember to hit the subscribe or follow button for more gems concerning life in and around RG10. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.